Welcome to the Haunted Radio Show, the only YouTube channel guaranteed to promote paranormal activity wherever you might be, and you cannot prove me wrong. I'm your host, Luke Marone, and today's episode I'm talking about The Hills Run Red, a 2009 slasher film written by David J. Show and directed by Dave Parker. This movie came to my attention via an article on Bloody Disgusting by Patrick Bromley. He's talking about how The Hills Run Red is an underappreciated gem of the slasher genre, and it's kind of a meta movie, so I was like, you know what? I need a subject for this episode of The Haunted Radio Show. I'm gonna watch it, I'm gonna talk about it. Way back when I started this, like all of 3 weeks ago, I would write the scripts, and that's why I sounded awful. Now, I just come up with ideas on the fly, think, alright, I can probably talk about that for like half an hour. So that's what I do. I feel like I sound a little more natural, but maybe you guys don't like it. I don't know. This is just something I do for funsies, so this is more fun for me. Anyway, onto the movie itself. The Hills Run Red. This came about because Happy Death Day 2U was just released. Happy Death Day was actually a very good slasher movie. I liked it a lot more than I thought I was going to, because I believe it was PG-13. And slasher movies, PG-13, don't really go well together. Like, part of the appeal of a slasher movie is kind of the violence and the gore in it. And you're obviously not getting that in a PG-13 movie as much as maybe you would want. So, I was a little apprehensive about it, but turns out I really liked it. It's not your typical slasher movie, and that's kind of why it succeeds. It's very focused on the main character. Her name is Tree. There's a great sort of emotional character arc for her, and it's a very character heavy kind of movie, which once again stands in contrast to what you're used to in a slasher movie, which is kind of just dumb stereotypes getting murdered in a variety of pretty creative, graphic ways. But, why is this relevant to The Hills Run Red? Because the killer in the Happy Death Day franchise is called Babyface. It's a killer running around with a baby mask, hence the name Babyface. And The Hills Run Red also has a killer. Definitely has a baby face, definitely has a baby mask, even though it's way more creepy and kind of fucked up looking. Very grimy. I don't remember if the character is actually referred to as Babyface. He might have been. But there's a whole like real fucked up backstory. This Babyface is much more along the lines of classic slasher villains, like Leatherface or Jason Voorhees. He's disfigured. He's that masked, huge kind of mountain man sort of assailant. And so much more your typical sort of slasher villain. But this movie isn't necessarily typical. As I mentioned at the top, it's a pretty meta kind of movie. And to me, it read almost like a sort of like Scream in a post-Saw landscape. Obviously, Scream was that first movie to address sort of the tropes of the slasher and the horror genre. And that was kind of its claim to fame, was that the characters, it's not like they knew they were in a horror movie, but they were aware of horror movies, and they were able to act smarter than your average protagonist because they're aware of the certain rules and the tropes in a slasher movie. There's sort of this meta commentary. It's not so much, there's a few references to, like, one of the characters is like, oh, we're going out into the woods, we're isolated from society. He brings a gun. He figures that the cell phones won't work, which, twist, they actually do. They're just not very useful. Stuff like that is kind of the Scream vibe. And then I'm actually going to get into the plot so I can sort of describe some of the other meta aspects. I'm going to kind of talk about the general gist of this movie, and then I'm going to close out with my thoughts on it. And then I'm going to go to bed. Because while this is being released Friday morning, I'm filming it or recording it Thursday night. And I'm very tired right now. Anyway, so the movie is about this dude named Tyler, played by Tad Hilgenbrick. Yeah, Tad Hilgenbrick. I'm not gonna lie, the acting wasn't so great. The characters are actually fairly interesting and compelling, but the acting isn't phenomenal, especially the whole time because of its sort of meta aspect. I was in my head sort of comparing it to Scream the whole time. When you do something like this, I think you kind of invite that sort of comparison, and I think there are aspects where that really worked against this movie. Maybe somebody else watching this sort of has a different kind of mindset while they're watching it. Maybe it's not as distracting. But for me, that meta aspect was always calling back to Scream, and that just reminded me of how much better the acting was in that movie. But this wasn't a bad movie. So it's this dude named Tyler. He's obsessed with this movie called The Hills Run Red, which was apparently released for like a weekend in the 80s, but it was too graphic. It was pulled out of theaters. The film was lost, and it just sort of disappeared into obscurity. And there's just this air of mystery around it because nobody has seen it. People don't know if it really even exists or not. So he's on a quest to find it and prove its existence, at the cost of his relationship with his girlfriend Serena, played by Janet Montgomery, who I think was probably my least favorite character in the movie. Well, not necessarily least favorite character. I think of the actors, she was probably the weakest link. I don't know, it didn't seem like she was super committed to it. She wasn't really selling me on how terrifying this whole situation was. Honestly, neither did Tad Hilgenbrick as Tyler. The only person who I really bought it from was Alex Wyndham as Tyler's friend Lalo, which is also just a great name. That's unique. That was the only name I could remember from the movie, without having to do a little Wikipedia research for this video. So he was great. So basically, they're kind of like a film crew. They're friends. They managed to track down the daughter of the director of The Hills Run Red, the movie in the movie, not the movie. And her name is Alexa. She's played by Sophie Monk. And she leads them to a house in the woods where her father's film is supposedly hidden. And then they get attacked by the babyface killer. The gore and the effects in this movie aren't phenomenal. Uh, it's pretty violent. Like I said, this is post Saw, so there's sort of that torture porn aspect, especially later in the movie. Um, and there's even a little commentary about that, uh, about contrasting that sort of torture porn kind of thing with the classic slasher genre. Stuff like that I thought was pretty interesting. Um, I do have to give this movie credit for attempting to be something more than a slasher movie and sort of have this conversation about film, um, about horror movies and where they are and where they're going. And so anything that tries to be more, you have to give credit for it. I mentioned in my Child's Play series overview that as bad as Seed of Chucky is, I still prefer that to Child's Play 3, just because Seed of Chucky at least tried to do something different and tried to be something more. And Child's Play 3 was just very by the books, basically just checking off on the list of horror movie tropes that it had established in the first two movies. So this movie, going along with that sort of Saw torture porn aesthetic, is super grimy and super dirty. Um, it's very gritty. It's got sort of like a grindhouse kind of vibe that I like, and that is one aspect where I prefer this movie to Scream, which is such a big budget production. It's very sleek, and I think at the time that really set it apart from previous slasher movies. But at this point, we have those two things. We have those two options. Neither one of them is new anymore. I just prefer that sort of dirty, grimier kind of look. And this movie absolutely has that. It gets very, not necessarily shocking, but it gets very violent. It gets very brutal. And that's sort of the catch in this movie. That's sort of the theme. And this is mentioned in Patrick Bromley's article on Bloody Disgusting. This is the sort of meta commentary of like, we as the audience want to see something really fucked up. And that's what these characters are looking for. Tyler, especially, is looking for the movie that was so scary and shocking that it was pulled from theaters. And once he gets there, obviously he gets what he was looking for, and it becomes a question of you wanted to see it. Now that you've seen it, are you even happy that you saw it? Especially with this sort of Saw mentality of like, you're just watching people get butchered. Is that really something you want to watch? And what does that do to you? These things aren't necessarily explored as much as I thought they could be. But like I said, the movie absolutely gets credit for even making the attempt and presenting the audience with these sort of ideas. ultimately, I don't think these characters are super memorable. I don't think that the babyface killer in this movie is sort of franchise material. And that's something that Patrick Bromley brought up in the article is this movie was direct to DVD, and had it been released in theaters, it could have spawned a whole franchise. Um, I'm not necessarily sure I agree that it deserves a franchise, but I could very easily see this becoming a franchise had it been more popular when it was released, because of its sort of direct to video nature. I guess it was overlooked. Um, and he's sort of hoping that 10 years later, with Babyface as the killer in Happy Death Day, maybe it'll draw attention to the Hills Run Red, and I think it worked. I mean, I'm an example of uh, this this sort of phenomena of being presented with this film. I liked it. I would recommend that people check it out. I think it has some very interesting ideas. Ultimately, though, I think the execution leaves a little something to be desired. Like I said, the acting isn't necessarily all that great. The effects, I really don't think stand up at all. Especially, this was released in 2009. This was made. Man, this is the one time I didn't write down what the budget was. But obviously, this was a very low budget film in comparison to Friday the 13th, the reboot. But, I still get the feeling we could have had much better effects in this. There's a few instances of some really bad, like, CGI involved as well. So, this isn't, if you're really into slasher movies because of the gore effects, that's certainly not something that's going to draw you in here. And just generally, there were a few direction choices that I thought weren't that great. There's, especially in the first half of the movie, there's a lot of really quick cuts where some horrifying image will flash on screen for a split second, and it didn't do anything for me. Part of it is presented as sort of like a mockumentary. Honestly, the cuts, they were just very distracting and kind of took me out of it. I would find myself sort of slowly getting invested into these characters, and then some stupid flashy cut would happen, and it really just took me out of it. It was almost like the director Dave Parker was like afraid that the first half was too boring, because it is a little bit slow, but I think the characters are at least compelling enough that it doesn't drag, and their journey is interesting enough that you could have just had it be them, and you could have had just normal transitions between scenes instead of these weird, like, music video kind of cuts. Besides that, there were a few instances where the 180-degree rule was broken. If you never took any sort of film class or really any sort of storytelling, like, I learned about this from drawing comic books, and then I saw it in my little high school film class. So I'm not too much of a film snob. It's just sort of a general storytelling rule, is that if you've got two characters talking, you shoot it from the same side so that one character, for example, will be facing left, one character will be facing right, and you get the sense that they're talking to each other. There were definitely, I definitely remember two. There might have been a few more, but there were a couple scenes where people would be talking to each other, but it would be shot so they were both sort of looking in the same direction. That sort of thing, I don't know that the average moviegoer is going to consciously pick up as wrong, but I think that's the kind of thing where everybody's going to see it and they're going to think this just isn't on par with some of the other films I've seen. So, stuff like that. It's not as well put together as it could have been, but it's got some really interesting ideas. And the killer is pretty cool. There's a few twists, a few things that you see coming from a mile away. But then there are a few genuine surprises and a few moments of that sort of black comedy, that sort of gallows humor of the irony of you being aware of these tropes and the killer not necessarily falling into those tropes. So, The Hills Run Red, 2009, directed by Dave Parker. I would recommend it. I watched it on Vudu and I think I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I would check it out. I think it's worth looking at. I think I would like to see more movies in this franchise because stuff like this where horror is always evolving, there's always new horror movies out, somebody's always changing the genre. Something like this could be a cool series to just progress alongside of horror as a genre and just sort of examine the tropes and the audience reaction to it and what we're expecting and what the filmmakers were going for. I think that would be fun. So ultimately, I'm going to recommend it. I'm not going to assign any sort of score to it besides the fact that I gave it 3 out of 5 stars on Vudu. I'm just going to say, go ahead and watch it. Come up with your own opinion. And then meet me back here and start typing away in the comments what you thought of this movie. Alright. Yeah, so contact me here on my channel, on Twitter at ShowHaunted, or hauntedradioshow@gmail.com. With that, that's it. That's it. This is Luke Marone signing off. Happy Friday, everybody.